So Gerry O'Neill, some of you may know, many of you will know. Gerry is a writer. He writes on sorry, my son is distracted me. Is Yoshi okay? So Gerry writes on Substack The West's Awake, and I suppose that's one aspect of Gerry's writing. Gerry is rebellious in the best sense of the word. He's challenging things through his writing, which is something that Brian did. And for me, that aspect of Brian's life, Brian as a writer, is the thing that has connected to me most profoundly. But there's so many aspects of his life that we can connect to. And in Brian's writing, I found this piece today actually that I thought I'd very quickly share, which is Brian was a successful short story writer originally, and then progressed to writing novels. And he was asked to give a short piece in a collection of essays to help other aspiring writers. So sort of a collection of stories. What would you do if you were starting out, kind of thing. So he wrote this short essay called Empathy Creates Living Characters in Fiction. So Brian was trying to advise writers about how to successfully write. And I suppose if I could just read very briefly from it. We've all read books, and some very good books, in which the characters didn't live at all, in which they were just cardboard cutouts, mouthpieces for the author. And then there are plenty of mediocre books in which one or two characters spring alive and redeem the whole thing. Now it seems to me that this springing alive is a kind of small miracle, which hasn't a lot to do with other literary virtues. It doesn't really depend on imagination. What it does depend on, in my mind, is sympathy, or rather empathy, that special kind of imagination which lets you put yourself in someone else's shoes. Real empathy requires subordination of self, a making blank of your own mind to let another personality take over for the time being. He must make his mind blank, he must receive the character into the vacuum, he must be the character, he must listen to it and not tell it what to do or to be. And that aspect of listening is obviously central to much of Brian's later writings. And my father asked Gerry to come today to share this celebration with us, and I think it's a great choice because Gerry has buckets of empathy. If you read even just one piece by Gerry, you'll see that empathy. And he's following through his writing a spiritual thread. He's pulling at something, and it's fascinating to watch and read. So we're very, very lucky to have Gerry here with us today. So I'm not going to waffle on too much more, other than to say thanks again for all of you for coming. Gerry and my dad are going to talk now a little bit about the book. Afterwards, if you want to ask questions, please do feel free. And as I said, there's books available and snacks, so do help yourself at any time.
Television doesn't like rebels, and I suppose the aspect of this I kind of identify a little bit with is the rebellious heart, and the, sometimes the mingling into your spirituality in that, sometimes you need to tame it, at times you need to let it go, and I found a lot of that over the last 3 years, and it's not a straight path, is all I can say. But I just wanted to basically give you a little just background, because I've read the book, not knowing anything about Brian Cleeve, and there's certain synchronicities you kind of pull out. His first wife Veronica and Brian got married on my birthday. He was made a Lance Corporal in the British Army on my birthday, so I'm either on the path of love, or I might be in British intelligence. But I suppose where I wanted to start with you really today is it's just a conversation, and if there's something at any point you want to jump in and ask, or have to say, just do it. Brian obviously had a very profound effect on your life, and you came into his life. Maybe if we start at the end, maybe. And just give us a little taste of how you met him and why he had such a, profound impact on your own life.
It's a very good question, Gerry. Put myself up to the microphone so I can hear what I'm saying. And I was thinking about this myself because I guess you might ask the question about the book, why on earth did I ever, why was I attracted by what this man was saying? And I think like a lot of people my age and maybe older, I was familiar with Brian Cleeve on the television during the 1960s. And that was about as far as it went. I was a working class kid. He was, a very well-known celebrity at the time. I never thought our paths would ever cross. Never even thought about that possibility. And then years later, when he had faded from public view, I came across an article in the Sunday newspaper in which he was being interviewed about a new book he was publishing, which was very different to anything he'd ever written before, as far as I could see. And I was instantly grabbed by this article because it was talking about an aspect of Brian Cleeve's life that I knew nothing whatsoever about. If I knew the man at all, as a reporter on television for 7 days and Discovery and lots of other programs in the 1960s, but I never imagined him being interested in anything to do with the more existential questions of life, the deeper questions which were bothering me and I suppose a lot of people at the time, but never really in a way that I could articulate. And suddenly this guy was talking about God in a way that is completely different from anything I'd seen before. And I was hooked by the article, but not hooked enough to want to know more about it. I was hooked in a way that people are hooked by things they read and never even dream of contacting the person concerned. So although I knew that this was something profound, I wasn't exercised enough to actually want to go any further with it. So I didn't bother going any further. I was interested in what he was saying. The books that he was talking about in the article were published shortly afterwards. I remember I couldn't afford to buy them, even though they were quite cheap at the time. They seemed now to be ridiculously cheap. But back in 1980, I wasn't earning a huge amount of money and I wasn't earning enough to buy books. So I used to sneak into Eason's. I worked on High Street. I used to sneak into Eason's shop across the road from where I worked. And I would actually sneak a look at the book and I'd put it back on the shelf and I'd walk out again. And I gradually got through most of the book that way. And eventually I saved enough money to buy it and I bought it. So in that way I was kind of easing myself into a situation. But I knew there was something happening which I couldn't really articulate. And eventually, it took a while, but eventually I wrote to the man. And I said, I found that he lived in Dublin, and I wrote to him, I said, you don't know anything about me, but I'm very interested in what you're writing in this book. What do you think? And I sent him a stamped addressed envelope because I wasn't sure he'd actually reply to my letter. Why would he reply to a stranger's letter? And he sent me back his own reply in my envelope with my stamp on the front. And I was delighted to have this letter from this man who I'd only heard about and read about in the papers. And we kept up a correspondence and eventually said, listen, you don't need to keep sending me stamped addressed envelopes. I'm quite happy with papers. So I stopped, and after that it was fine. But I was quite intimidated at first by this celebrity as I saw him. But I was so captivated by what he was saying that I kind of overcame my own inhibitions in order to contact him. That was the start of my contact with Brian Cleeve, and eventually saying, as you say, I wrote this book after his life. So.
And just before we move on, if you could put it in a couple of sentences, what was it that was singing to your spirit about what you read? Were you like exploring a spiritual journey yourself, or were you something in it awakened, something inside of your own self?
It's very hard to, I wouldn't have been able to articulate it at the time. I suppose since I've had a chance to think about these things and to reflect on them, at the time I hadn't a clue what was going through my mind, except I suppose I was like a lot of people, I was lost, looking for something which I couldn't really articulate what it was I was looking for. I suppose like a lot of people, I was a cradle Catholic, being brought up in Dublin. But that, that wasn't satisfying enough for me. I was experimenting with various things. I remember I went to a transcendental meditation meeting one time. I went to a charismatic renewal meeting one time. And these were very different to each other, but they were interesting in a way. They were really addressing what I felt I wanted. But I couldn't say what I wanted until I saw it. And when I read that article, I realised this is it. But I didn't realise it enough to want to actually do anything about it for at least a couple of years. So this was in 1980. So it was about 2 years later I actually contacted Brian himself. So it took me 2 years to kind of get it all settled. I was a slow learner, but eventually I got there.
So I suppose just for people that wouldn't know Brian or anything about him, because the title of the book is Television Doesn't Like Rebels. It's such a small, RTE is such a small part of this, vibrant, how you describe his life. Like by the time he was 25, he had 2 or 3 lives. Maybe take us through Brian's family history, because you have the Cleeve condensed milk enterprise in Limerick, and that's this huge kind of, we'll say, business back in, pre-turn of the 20th century, and the rise and fall of that.
Yeah, I mean, Brian was quite a posh individual. He's from a pretty well-off background. Cleeve's Toffee was how I knew the brand, because Cleeve's Toffee was still around when I was a kid. And if you ate it, you kind of lost half your teeth.
People from Limerick, and they are this week, and they remember it like.
Yeah, but the name is still in current down there. So, yeah, he was part of that dynasty, if you like, Cleeve's Toffee. And there were quite wealthy people who had started this business in Limerick, condensing milk and producing all sorts of byproducts like toffee. And it became huge. And Brian was born just as it was starting to take a dive for various reasons, which I go into in the book, which I won't rehearse here. But they were still pretty well off, and his father had managed somehow to extricate himself from all this. So Brian was born in England, and his father still retained a fair bit of money and sent Brian to a posh public school, sent him to a boarding school when he was 7. And they were kind of, I suppose you could call them Anglo-Irish people, because his father was born in Ireland, but Brian himself was born in England. So Brian's father moved to England, where Brian was born. And
I think you mentioned in the book that his mother's Josephine side of the family were quite on the social ladder, were a little bit.
It's all ridiculous. It seems ridiculous now, and it seems very strange. I don't really understand it, how all that worked out. I mean, I heard all this stuff and I put it down there, but I don't really understand the subtleties of English society enough to comment on that bit. But Brian, even though he was quite posh, he wasn't regarded as being posh enough, which is ridiculous. But anyway.
There's just one little thing in that episode, that period of his childhood. His mother Josephine died when he was 2.5.
Yeah.
He went to live with his grandparents for a period of time. Then he was sent into boarding school at 7, 8. St. Edward's. Then after that, he ran away, we'll say. But I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on, whether there's almost a sense of abandonment there in the psyche of somebody, that's a lot of trauma, and it's also a lot of kind of alienation, and moving from his dad to his grandparents and then back to his dad. been into a strict boarding environment?
Yeah, I don't know as well as some of the people here, so I don't want to say too much, but I get the impression he wasn't. I think what you say is true. I think he was a very sensitive man, and I guess he would have felt his father in particular wasn't as supportive of him, maybe.
Monetarily supportive.
He gave him money from time to time, yeah. I don't know his father, so I can't really say. I'll only comment on that based on what I've been told and read about it. But to look at over 2.5 years of age wouldn't be
I guess
a great start.
I suppose not again synchronicity. I'm more even like in the outs, because I think one of the things about his writing is he's got outsiders. He has that outsiders vista on things, and the synchronicity for myself is I would have been born in New York, moved to Ireland when I was 5, went to a boarding school, and there's a perspective I think you might get sometimes from that, because and I'm wondering, rather than it being like a sadness or a tragedy, if that was that a clue to how his life might have, the life he led, might have been a wonderful life, very, successful life at the moment.
Yeah, there are deep questions there which I really feel very difficult in answering, because Brian lived a very colourful and eventful life, as you say. Was that because of the start? I have no idea. I was fortunate enough to meet his second cousin, who was older than he was, after Brian died. And the impression I got now was that he would have been more in keeping with the family tradition or culture than Brian himself, who I guess would have been a kind of a black sheep of the family. The man I'm talking about was his second cousin, Harry Cleeve, who died, oddly enough, at the age of 103, about a decade ago. He was a lot older than Brian. And he was much more in the spirit of the Anglo-Irish, Anglican, elite, aristocratic type of person than I guess Brian would have been. Brian was much more unconventional, is the word I use. Not to use the word rebellious, but he was. That's Brian's old phrase, by the way. Television doesn't look rebels. It was a phrase he used when he was asked about his time on RT and why he left the station years after. Well, maybe not years after that, but he said our television doesn't like rebels. And he was pretty unconventional. He was. I'm not saying he was always looking for a fight. He wasn't. He was a very sensitive gentleman in many ways, but he didn't shy away from confrontation, whether it was with people trying to get him confirmed in public school, or people trying to get him to toe the line in South Africa when he was mouthing off about the way the blacks had been treated, or whether people were trying to trying to get him to curb his enthusiasm, and he didn't want to do that. So I guess he wasn't afraid to stand up for himself without being apology.
When did his ability to write start to manifest in his life? Because just one of the things about Brian is that, from reading the book, he's a prolific writer of short stories, poetry, novels. There's the spiritual books, there's the screenplays, there's the radio plays. It's like, I write 2,000 words and I want like a round of applause. And it's just amazing to me that, prolific ability and success too, and I just wondered what you thought on you know, when that started to manifest. Because this is a young guy that went off to war, lied about his age, and at some point manifest into this genius writer.
Well, there is one clue in the book where, when he was still in school, he mentioned his ambitions to be a writer. Told his teachers, and the teachers said, "Oh, Cleeve, you'll never be a writer." That was really from a very young age when he was in school. So I guess that's the start when you start reading and consuming books voraciously when you're very young. And I guess he was writing poetry in school, so I guess he was a teenager when he was writing poems published in the school magazine. So I don't know, I never came across anything before that. This would be when he was about 16, 17 years of age. I'm sure he was writing before then. And maybe somebody has surviving scraps of childish handwriting, but that's as early as I was able to find.
He obviously had the inner confidence and audacity to try and get stuff published, and was very successful at that.
Well, eventually, yeah.
But
Eventually, he wrote books which he was interested in, but nobody else seemed to be. At least nobody was willing to publish them. And then eventually he wrote a novel, which was based really on his own life and grandpa's life, called The Far Hills. That was the first of his books to be published, but it was the third or fourth he'd written. But it was the first to really grab the attention of the publisher. And it's a very good book. I mean, it's really very good. If you want to read about life in Dublin in the 1940s, it's actually very good. So you can understand why they wanted to publish it. But he was a writer who wrote popular fiction because that's what people wanted. I think if he was left to his own devices, he would have written far more esoteric stuff. And he did write far more esoteric stuff, which nobody wanted to publish or read. And I came across stuff that I never even knew existed when I was doing my research with Damon in Boston, where his papers are now. And he'd written reams of stuff, which never got beyond his own desk, I think, because it was a bit too esoteric. This is back in the 50s, I think.
My own sense from the book, and we'll get to some of the other episodes from the writing aspect. I got a sense of a special draw for the short stories, and the famous line, like famously was published in a US weekly journal that got him $825 of a term, which must have been like whatever, 20 or 30 grand. But one of the interesting notes there is, like, you know, when you go back to the physical written word, I think that publication and circulation in your in the books is of 6 million readers a week, and you know, it goes to show where we were then as a kind of reading species as to where we were now. I doubt there's one or two that do that kind of number.
Yeah, the Saturday Evening Post was a big deal in the years before television really hit America. It was an American publication, and they would sell like millions and millions of copies. It was I suppose, the precursor to television in those days, which advertisers liked, and they would pay huge money to people like Brian. I think they gave $4,000 to F. Scott Fitzgerald for one of his stories, because it was worth it to them to have somebody of his calibre writing for him. So lots of people, like Norman Rockwell was an artist who paid pictures for their covers. They paid big money to writers, and Brian wouldn't have been huge at the time, obviously, but he was writing good stuff and they wanted a bit of it. And I think he ended up publishing over 20 stories with that particular magazine, and he got paid a lot of money.
Like, it's funny because I've been reading Patrick Kavanagh's biography side by side with this, and they overlap for maybe 10 or 15 years now. But Kavanaugh's about 15 years older than Brian was. But if you need to get to here before in this book before Patrick Kavanagh gets a job or can find a publisher or can do anything. And it's quite a contrast to Brian, 'cause I think not just being a good writer, he had like an entrepreneurial spirit that will say a Kavanagh, or maybe he had somebody around him that had him off, that Kavanagh didn't, would say, have. And one of the things about it was I was wondering, like, did these two ever cross paths in their lives in Dublin? Because they would have been there, I think maybe the early 50s, that kind of time period. But I'm not asking you, I'm just
I don't know.
I'm
I'm sure they did, maybe professionally, because Brian interviewed so many different people. He could well have interviewed Calvin, I don't know. But yeah, Brian, I suppose maybe had picked up some entrepreneurial flair from his family background. But I guess he had that kind of get up and go spirit himself. And he was determined to feed his family and his wife and children, and that was it. And he was prepared to, he wants to write. And nobody wants to read what he wants to write, but he wants to write. So he wrote, I think, good stuff that was also popular. I've read everything he's written, and I think his novels they're just superb. But they're also very easy to read. Those early novels he wrote before people joined jpbruce.ie they're really very good. And they sold, obviously, because he was obviously getting paid pretty well for it.
So I've jumped around a little bit there, but to focus on some of the writing aspects of his life. But I suppose maybe if we take it back to when he's 16, 17, and we're talking about a time in the world, World War II's on the horizon, or let's see, and he joins the British Army. Now, you can take it from the year before that if you want, but that, I suppose I was surprised because he went into the army as a private, having had a rather, good education, if you like, a private school education. And that was a surprise to me, maybe it shouldn't be.
Well, they did recognise that eventually. They realised that they had somebody who was capable of doing more than just whatever he was doing as a private. And they sent him to officer training school. He became an officer after about a year in the army. But Brian had run away from school, he'd run away to sea. He basically abandoned the life that was being carved out for him as a kind of, I suppose, a scion of a pretty well-off family. And he decided to carve his own path, and he went off, became a dog's body on the Queen Mary, and then when that finished, he decided to become a servant in various big houses around London. That didn't work out terribly well. So the next thing was the army. He saw a sign for the army. I suppose he felt that maybe there was a war looming, and he thought he would join up. He was only 17 at the time, big fella, and they thought, okay, we're not going to turn him away, so let's just change the date of his birth and make him 18. And so he was in the army, and they realised this guy's a bit different to the other privates who were sent into officer training school that he did.
Did you get a sense that there was any tension with his father or his family about the path he was taking at that stage of his life?
I'd say his father was delighted that he was an officer, because his father had been an officer in the First World War and had distinguished himself very well in the First World War, so I guess they would have been pleased that Brian now was at last, coming on board, and he was a second lieutenant, which is probably the lowest level you could be in the army. He was sent off to Africa, and things looked good from their point of view, so I'm guessing they would be pretty happy with the turn his life was taking at this stage.
Now, he did end up in prison.
He did end up. They didn't like that as much, I don't think, because they were out of it. He ended up in prison, and he eventually ended up as a kind of a merchant seaman, which was back where he started from. He was now back down the chain again. as an ordinary sailor, swabbing the decks and doing all the stuff that emergency seaman does. And he was, at night then, he was basically spying on the Germans in places like, well, mainly in Lisbon and places like that, in Dublin as well, on behalf of British intelligence. It's a very kind of murky story which needs a bit more time than we have here to describe it. His life changed quite dramatically over a short period. When he went from being an officer in Africa to being a spy and a sailor in the North Atlantic.
Now he would have been sent, his World War II post, if you like, would have been to Kenya and Africa.
Yeah, that was originally when he was still in the army as an officer. He went to Kenya and he was serving in Nairobi. He didn't particularly like what he saw there in the way the whites in South Africa, or not South Africa, in Kenya were treated, the majority black population. And in one particular incident, he took umbrage at the sight of his fellow officers, white, beating up a black prisoner, didn't like it at all, and got into trouble for his vociferous reaction, and was basically court-martialed and sent to prison because he was given out about the way that his fellow officers were treating black people, and so he had to get out of this bloody army because it's disgraceful. So that kind of thing wouldn't have gone down well with the powers that be at the time.
Yeah.
So he was cashiered, as I said.
I suppose, you brought up the whole military intelligence aspect, and of course there'll be a few of us from the, want to hear more about that. But like, it would have, we were talking earlier, one of the things is, he was an Anglican, and then he at some point became a baptized Catholic. It would have been around the period of when, we'll say, he would have got that post, that military intelligence post in Dublin. Did you see that, like, or did you ever have conversations about that conversion to Catholicism?
Well, the timing of the conversion is slightly after. It was after he got out of prison. It was after he had become a spy, and it was after he had joined the Merchant Navy. So he was, I think, on his first ship, which was going across the Atlantic from England to America. And at a certain point he decided to become a Catholic, and he went to a church in Boston, having got off the ship, and said, "I want to be a Catholic." He was only, I guess, about 20, 21 maybe at the time. Now, I don't know why he decided to become a Catholic at that stage. One can only guess.
But obviously the rebellious spirit is searching and for something, like I would have said, maybe from...
Well, maybe it was sparked by this desire he had from childhood to become closer to God. He had a kind of a non-Catholic background, but he had one experience of the Catholic Church as a child which terrified him. So I don't know, there's a number of things which may have led to his ultimately deciding to become a Catholic. But he became a Catholic anyway and stuck with it for a few years. And then he got a bit fed up with the way the Catholic Church was carrying on in the 50s, and himself and his wife were annoyed with various aspects of Irish Catholic teaching.
We've been alone there in a second.
So I don't think it lasted maybe, 10 years. And then he became what he called himself an agnostic. And then he became a Catholic again, and then he became something else again. So it's a long and convoluted story, his religious background.
When you got to know him, the 80s, you just stood forward again, and what was, because I know you've told me before, there were certain aspects of his life you didn't have a clue about, and you had this long friendship until his death. What was the most surprising thing you learned after his death that you would have had?
Well, I think I was saying to you, Gerry, that I was asked to speak at his funeral, and I thought I knew the man very well. And it was only after that I learned that he had been a fencing champion in his past. Now, I'm not even sure I knew he was a fencer, never mind a fencing champion. And that's just one tiny detail. Obviously I knew his television background, I knew various things about him. But he wasn't the kind of guy that would go around saying, I used to be, I was the fencing champion of Ireland. He wouldn't be like that. So he wouldn't necessarily boast about his achievements in life. That was one thing that surprised me.
Would you look at that? Was he a man that compartmentalised different aspects of his life with different people, or was, you know what I'm not trying to say it in a negative sense, I mean it in a, that would be just normal, aspects of parts of his life that he just, I did that, it's done, and it's almost forgotten about, but not, you know what I mean? It doesn't live in the past.
I think the thing that surprised me when I began to research was I went over to Boston with Damien, and we went through his papers in the university where he had donated his papers. I was astounded by some of the stuff I was reading, because there were lots of letters there which he had written to his publishers. And the thing that astonished me most about those letters was how, I can't even find the word. The word that comes to mind is self-effacing, but it's much more than that. It's a complete disregard for his own value as a novelist. How can I put it? Because it seems he did value his work as a novelist. He was obviously making money, and he wanted to make more money, but he didn't mind criticism as much as he would have thought he would. He said that he would give drafts of his books, his latest book, to his wife to read, and if she didn't like it, he'd throw it in the fire. That was the end of it. And so was the next one. I came across books that I never heard of, that were never published, which may well have ended up in the fireplace. I have no idea what happened to them. I just know about them because he maybe researched in a letter he wrote to somebody. But he just would move on to the next thing and forget about the last thing. And he wasn't investing huge quantities of himself into these books. They were just, he wrote and that was it. And that's something I don't really understand, because, when you're like me, you kind of spend so much time poring over every sentence, or every comma, every dot, before you let something go, and constantly tweaking stuff. He had just such a facility for writing, and he could toss off manuscripts, books even, in a matter of weeks. I mean, it's just, I'm in awe really of that wonderful facility. Not many people have it, but he was one of them.
Yeah, no, the only contemporary of today, I think John Waters has that.
Yeah.
I remember him telling me a story about himself and Vincent Brown, whatever paper they were working at, and they had their quota of 1,500 words, and Vincent Brown was complaining about how am I going to get 1,500 words. And John's answer was, how am I going to get mine down to 1,500 words? So it seems to me that that may have been like part of Brian's kind of thing as well. It just kind of seems to flow,
Well, a novel of the stuff he wrote after I got to know was handwritten stuff and photocopied. And so, with very little crossed out, he just would write and pour out of them, and it was beautifully formed, sometimes quite lengthy sentences that just seemed to appear on the page without any kind of drafting or redrafting. And as I say, that's something I find very difficult not to admire. It's just tremendous quality to have.
There's a compartment there of his life I've kind of skipped over, but I suppose after that war period in Dublin, he meets Veronica, they get married, they go on an adventure to South Africa, And I'd say the journey to South Africa is a book in itself, because it took so long and there were so many stops and starts on the way.
Yeah, the adventure he had, even getting to South Africa.
What was the motivation to go there, do you think?
The motivation was somebody he met in Sweden who was from South Africa, a count, I believe, and I don't know why this count was in Sweden, but anyway, he was able to paint such a picture of South Africa that attracted Brian and Veronica to want to go there. I think the weather would have been a big factor because Sweden was quite cold. So they eventually got there and lived there for a number of years until he got thrown out. Had a good life there. And
again, the entrepreneurial element was there because he was the perfume was so part of there.
Well, he saw the potential for an idea Veronica had, which was to sell perfume in one of these stores in a department store, but not just perfume. Attached to each bottle was a kind of a horoscope for each of the months of the year. So that proved to be the big draw. He made a small fortune selling these horoscope stroke bottles of perfume. And that was through Brian's entrepreneurial flair. Veronica had done it herself as an employee back in Ireland, but I think Brian turned it into a proper business which got them out of a financial hole big time. They could buy their house, in fact, as a result of that enterprise. Now, Brian was definitely an entrepreneur. He wouldn't sit around waiting for things to happen to him. He made things happen. And the thing about RTE is, that's where most people know him is, I reckoned that RTE was the longest place he had been in, including school, the army, anywhere. Not just employments, but in terms of any institution to which he belonged. RTE was the longest. But I guess they wanted to get rid of him after about 4 or 5 years. And he lasted about 12. That says a lot for his own ability to withstand pressure.
And just take us to that part, we'll say, because RTE was up in 1961. He'd have been still young, like 40 maybe, that kind of age. And how did he manage to come back to what we'll say he came back to Ireland from South Africa? How did he manage to get into art? Like that fledgling RTE, there would have been quite a lot of, competition. Was he known at that stage as, was he widely known as a writer?
Well, he had been writing for various newspapers up to that point. He also had been a scriptwriter on the radio. But he wouldn't have been a well-known figure. His first job was as a kind of an interviewer where he wasn't on a fixed contract, he wasn't getting a wage, he was competing with other people. So if they wanted someone to interview so-and-so, they had a pick of several people they could ask to be the interviewer. And Brian would wait by the phone at home to see would RTE call him to do that particular interview. This would have been shortly after they started. So I think he had a bike at that stage. He didn't drive a car as far as I know, so he cycled to Donnybrook, if that's where he had to go. And he gradually built up a reputation as a reliable and sound and calm presence. I think that was the thing that impressed people about RTE, because it's a very fraught environment. Brian gives the impression of being a very calm individual. He's very kind of centered.
It must have been a shock to the system in a sense that here's a country late to the game in television, really, and a handful of people become massively known kind of overnight. Do you know what I mean? In the sense that what had you maybe 10 or 15 faces on the new RTE or whatever it might be, but these would the psychology of people at that stage, television is very new, and that must have been something to deal with.
Yeah, well, Brian liked television. He liked it as a medium to change the way people thought in this country. I suppose he would at the time felt that Ireland was a little bit too self-enclosed and needed to be opened up to the world, and television was a way of doing that. And he was very much of the view that he should be one of the people leading Ireland into this new world of openness to other parts of Europe, other parts of the world, and not to be so focused on itself, inward looking. And that upset quite a few people, as you can imagine, in RTA, and he made quite a few enemies in there. And I guess that's how he was eventually dropped. Those enemies they moved up the ladder, maybe they had a year of those who were on top of the ladder and they got him for, I don't know, will we ever know, but television doesn't like rabbits. It was his way of putting it, Brian was around.
From the time you spent together, was there any particular aspect of his past life, I say past life or past experiences that were real or present to him, or was he very focused in the present moment of what he was doing all the time?
Well, Brian would never talk about himself. I mean, this is the incredible thing. Like, when I began to research his life, I found out stuff about him which my jaw kept dropping to the floor. And even the bits I did know about him had to be dragged out of him by other people who were closer to him than I was. Because he just wouldn't talk about himself. He regarded himself as being of no interest to anybody. I remember reading something he wrote to a publisher when he was back in the 60s. And this publisher wanted something of a biographical piece that he could use to draw one of his books. And he said, surely only a psychiatrist would be interested in this kind of rubbish. But here it is anyway, sort of thing. And that's what he thought. He genuinely couldn't fathom why anybody would want to know anything about him personally. And that went right back, before his spiritual conversion. So I didn't really learn an awful lot about him from his own lips, unless I really put him under pressure, which I very rarely would have done. But I got a few bits and pieces, and the rest came through research after he died, unfortunately.
This is the updated edition of the book, and what specifically was the reason for you to sit down and to do it again? Did you feel you had it after, maybe 17, 18 years between editions?
Yeah, there's no great anniversary. I was looking at people who had published new editions of books they had originally published, and it's usually on the 20th anniversary or some date that coincides with the original book. But
did you feel you had a change in how you understood him after those 15 years, or was it pretty much
there were a few things, yeah. And I think the key one was that I felt I should do a new edition and launch it today, which happens to be his birthday, but in particular birthday. I if I was to psychoanalyse myself, it would be that having met his second cousin, Brian Cleeve, whom I got to know pretty well before he died, and he was 103 when he died. Brian would have been 103 today. It seems like a ridiculous age for anybody to live to. But there was a kind of physical defect in the Cleeve, in some members of the Cleeve family, which meant they had weak hearts, and a number of male members of the family died. And this particular individual, Harry Cleeve, had the same problem, but he was, I won't say he was running around like a 2-year-old when I knew him, but he was certainly compass mentis, and he was able to do his stuff up to more or less when he died. So I thought it would be a good coincidence to have a book like this republished with a few bits and pieces of extra information on it. At a time when Brian, theoretically anyway, could have been still with us.
What do you think he'd have coped with the last 3 or 4 years?
It's a very good question, and it's impossible to answer because how could anybody put themselves into the shoes of somebody who wasn't around? I'm just glad he didn't have to put up with it. Well, we've had to put up with the last few years, to be honest. In the sense that I would like him to have been around, but at the same time, it would be hideous. And he himself, I remember writing about Padre Pio, whom some people will know. And he met Padre Pio just before he died in the late 1960s professionally. And he said that Padre Pio died, I think in 68 or 69, before the full effects of the changes that had been instituted in the Catholic Church took effect. And it was probably a good thing that he missed all that stuff because it would have been a different institution to the one he knew. And maybe the world would have been a very different place to the one that Brian knew over the last 4 years.
Would his spiritual journey at that time, do you know, included Catholicism in the sense of going to Mass or that kind of thing?
Well,
and did yours?
The first time I saw Brian, it was after his conversion, but before I actually met him. So I think I was still writing to him. I happened to go to Mass one Sunday, and I just saw this figure about 3 or 4 seats in front of me. He never saw me, but it was actually Brian. And Brian did return to the Catholic Church. I was always a Catholic myself. And so Brian did go to Mass, and he did do everything that was expected of a Catholic at the time, as I did myself. And this was long after the changes that I referred to had taken place. This would have been in the early 1980s, I guess.
It's still a very cloistered country in the 80s, like I know it's expanded from like the 40s or 50s, but it's still...
Yeah. Well, Brian was writing for people, as it turned out, mainly in Ireland, who were of that culture. Like myself, people who were born up in a Catholic Ireland, and he was much more cosmopolitan than that. And he was writing something that would, I guess, appeal to people of that background. And he became that himself. I mean, this is what I find remarkable. Brian, before this, had been interested in all sorts of spiritual paths, like, all sorts of exotic things, like Carlos Castaneda, who was very big at the time. He was very interested in his books. So he was surprised to be told, as he was when he had his experience, to become a Catholic. And he had been through all that. He'd worn the t-shirt. So he wouldn't have chosen that for himself, but he became a
Was
Catholic.
that thing in RT, was that what was causing him trouble in art? Was there an element to that, do you think, in his drift from RT, if you like?
Well, it's impossible to know, but I think Patricia told me a story once of his not so much confronting, but meeting somebody at a much later event to commemorate the anniversary of RT's founding. Somebody who had, at the time he was in RTE, or both in RTE, had expressed his displeasure at Brian's way of speaking. And Brian mentioned this to the gentleman concerned, oh, by the way, do you remember you used to say to me, you like my voice, kind of thing. So I guess there was a degree of, I don't know, he was not a joiner, and he was different. And some people like that. I met people who loved him. and I met people who couldn't stand them, but were too polite to say that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Professional colleagues when I was doing my research. So he would rub people up their own way without. I mean, he was a lucky man, like, right?
But he wouldn't have been. His output would have, his output all through would have. He's not a name that's mentioned amongst the literary set of what we might know. Of those times. He and Calvin and all.
Yeah.
And that was one of the amazing things to me. Was like, his output is 4 or 5 times more than some of the most well-known names in Irish literature.
Well, I came across a review of one of his books by a very well-known Irish writer who was also a critic named Benedict Kiley, and it was a very positive review, but he mentioned that he had never seen Brian Cleeve in any of the pub crawls that he was in. I must say he was going to pub crawls, so he wasn't part of that set, and he wondered how he had such great insight into the Irish psyche if he wasn't part of that set. And it's the same in RTE. Brian wouldn't go out drinking until hours of the day, and he would go home to his wife and children after work, and he wasn't a joiner, and people don't like that. So he was capable of tremendous insight, but he wasn't willing to sacrifice his life to be liked by these people. So he was never going to be regarded the same light as these other figures that you mentioned. He still wouldn't be.
What was your favourite thing about him?
Well, I loved his sense of humour. He had a tremendously.
I see some of his letters, comes across in his letters.
Yeah, he had a very dry sense. I like dry sense of humour. Where you're not sure if someone's actually making a joke or not, because they don't laugh. And yet, this wonderful Gary Larson, everybody knows that name, type of humour, where he would put one of his cartoons into a letter, and the cartoon would be exploding with laughter before you even read the letter. And he had a wonderful sense of humour, which was capable of just, in my case at least, sending me onto the floor with laughter. I think that's a rare gift. I don't come across that very often.
What's your last memory of him?
Well, as I say in the book, I spoke to him on the day he died on the phone, and then the last time I saw him was when he was dead, with Patricia. I guess the conversation I had with him on that day was the last memory I have of him as a living person, and I had no idea that it would be the last time I'd speak to the man. It's been the journey even to produce the second edition was much more fraught than I thought it would be. I thought it would be pretty much a straightforward approach, putting a new cover, putting a few extra bits and pieces, and then sending it out there. But no, it was more emotional than I thought it would be. So it's good.
Is there anything you want to say?
Well, the one thing that struck me is that most people who are certainly under my age never heard of Matt, and it was one of the reasons I thought he would be a good person to talk to, because you're of that generation. You haven't a clue Brian Cleeve is. His books are out of print. He himself is long forgotten. So I wondered what somebody coming fresh to him would make of the man, having learnt what you've learned from even reading the articles about him on the internet, never mind the book. So that was the only thing I wondered that you.
No, the hugely surprising like, I'd done a bit of research before we got the manuscripts. The way my head would work would be always just kind of comparison with the contemporary, what's going on now. Like, I don't think there's a writer alive that could do what he did today. I include John Morris, because I don't think we have the capability to process information the way not just Brian, but writers of that generation were able to do because of technology. I almost say it's like writers like this could hold a thought that long, and it's like it's shrinking. So there's a certain sadness to reading that. It's an amazing life, and it has questions, it's intrigue, and just so how much of some of these huge events of the 20th century that he was a part of. South Africa, World War II, his whole upbringing, and then his life in Ireland. So that was the kind of thinking would be going on in my head when looking at somebody like this. And just we've only spoken about books really, like his poetry, there's the screenplays he wrote while he was on TV. Like, he was multi-talented in a number of different disciplines. Now it's rare to get. Sometimes you find somebody that's good at two. But that's amazing to me. And the other side of it was it's almost like he couldn't stop himself. In terms of success or failure, he kept doing it. Discipline like that. Discipline to keep on doing it. But following his heart, if you like, as to what direction to go. And I'd like to get a hold of some of the spiritual stuff he was writing. That would probably interest me more as a next step, if you like.
Yeah, it's funny because when I began to publicise this event, I got a series of emails from somebody who had never heard of Brian Cleeve, but were fascinated by what they had learned from my emails, and weren't able to come to this event this evening. But because of what they had learned, they began to investigate it, and they had read one of his novels, Cry of Morning, and thought it was amazingly well written, which it is, of course. It's a fantastic book. And I had then gone on to some of the spiritual writings, and I read The House on the Rock. I began to get into that, and then came to a passage which they violently objected to, and then threw the book aside. So 40 years later, he still had the ability to cause controversy.
There's bravery in that too, because even if you do one form of writing and you change direction slightly, he doesn't strike me as someone who is enthralled to his readers.
Yeah.
And I find that would be another thing, quite a problem with in modern day, literature, and particularly, non-fiction writing, is that people become way too addicted to their own readership. He has a balance of, from my read, so some of the directions he chose obviously meant he was leaving people potentially behind, So I find that interesting. I find that brave.
Well, I'm immensely grateful to him because if I haven't made this clear already, the moment at which I became interested in this man's thinking was when I read that article back in 1980. And that was one of the pivotal moments in my life, which, if nothing else happened, and a lot did happen, but if nothing else happened apart from that, I would be amazingly grateful to him, because he changed the course of my life in that moment, without even knowing who the hell I was. I mean, he didn't know me from Adam. And that is something I could never possibly repay. It has nothing to do with anything we've talked about in relation to the army or school or RTA or anything like that. As far as I know, maybe it has, but it's something which I will never be able to express my gratitude enough for, because it was just a gift, and a gift that thankfully I wasn't foolish enough to reject when I came across it.
Well, I think you've done a good job expressing your gratitude, so well done on that. I don't have any more. Just open if anyone has any questions.
I just want to comment, perhaps you're grateful as a student for whatever touched you so deeply, is why you wrote the book.
Yeah, well, it certainly will be a big part of it. I wanted to understand the man as well, and I just wanted to find out more about him, because he wouldn't tell me himself. But yes, the book ultimately is a kind of a tribute to somebody who would otherwise have been forgotten. And sometimes I get annoyed when I see people who I think are good writers, but not in his class, being still created. And he is totally forgotten. And I'd like that to be rectified. That's purely personal thing. I think he gave far more than just his literary gifts to the world, to me anyway. So, but you're quite right. I think it was prime motivation.
I love to keep stuffing.
Apparently you can still get it. I think the brand has been sold to some other crowd, so I think it's still available. Whether it's the same formula, I have no idea.
Yeah, that's the truth. I remember Cleeve talking about it.
Yeah, back in the 60s
I
anyway.
remember on television at that time. Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah.
One of the very few.
Yeah, we that generation as well, yes, yeah. There was something about his accent, wasn't it, that they kind of made an excuse to kind of get rid of him. I'm not sure if that's true. I've heard.
That is true. Yeah, that,
She sort of.
yeah. He didn't like his, the fact that he was. Well, I don't know what, well, I can only speculate as to why.
Yeah.
What they reckoned, the official story was that they believed his off-screen narration. He would speak off-screen when he was doing one of his documentaries for Discovery, and they said his voice wasn't suitable. And this was like years after he'd been doing it and won awards for it. Suddenly they thought it was unsuitable, and they dropped it.
Yeah.
Now I think it was other factors that came to bear.
Yeah, so it's probably an excuse.
That was the beginning of this.
Funny, I was chatting to Paddy O'Gorman there about a month ago, and he had the same problem. There was one thing he highlighted was that British accent.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I asked him about Brian Cleeve, because I don't know anything book, but I knew I was going to be reading it, and he just barely remembered it about because I was trying to draw that. They have that kind of problem. They have the same problem, if you like.
Yeah, yes, I remember it. I saw that. Yeah.
We annoyed people in RTE. That's the only thing I can think of. And they eventually managed to get him out. It took a while for them to maneuver him out of the organisation. That's pure speculation.
Yeah.
Yeah, but now for any younger members, that's what a book looks like. They're here. And above, I'd just like to thank Jim for the, it's been a pleasure to be invited to the